Boldwood presents Daughters of Tuscany, written by Siobhan Daiko and read by Polly Edsel. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. For Prisca. Chapter 1. Emma tapped her heels against the dark bay flanks of her maremo mare, Bella, urging her into a trot up the steep, unmetalled road. Dust furled as she squinted in the warm May sunshine. The afternoon had turned hot, and she squeezed Bella's reins to slow her down to a walk. On her right rose the massive, ivy-covered red brick walls which enclosed the front gardens of the ochre-coloured Villa Bivio. Nearly 19 years ago, she'd come into the world there. It was her beloved home. The wide valley spread below, slopes of cultivated land, verdant with wheat, olives and vines, nestled below forested hills on one side, and the clay knolls known as Crete on the other. Hard to believe the estate had been virtually a desert when her parents had bought it back in 1920. It had suffered for centuries from a lack of water, but Papa had soon resided over an organisation of landowners and had begun working on water management projects to irrigate the land. He'd arrested the soil erosion, then turned his attention to reforestation, road building and planting. The Bivio was highly productive now, a far cry from the dismal place it had once been, and their tenant farmers consequently lived a much better life. Emma eyed the zigzag road opposite, lined with tall black-green cypress trees. She remembered Papa telling her the story of its origins. After her parents had bought the estate, the land at the top of the hill had been levelled and new farmhouses had been built. They'd needed a road, so Papa had decided to create a track inspired by 13th and 14th century Sienese and Florentine painters. It truly was beautiful, and Emma had ridden up it earlier to enjoy the fresh air. Her gaze swept beyond the valley towards Monte Amiata, an extinct volcano whose magnificence dominated the distant landscape. It always reminded her of the pictures she'd seen of Mount Fuji in Japan. She gave an involuntary shiver. Not quite a year and a half ago, Japan had gone to war with the Allies. The entire world was at war, it seemed. Papa said that the recent Axis defeat in North Africa had paved the way for an imminent invasion of Europe. He believed that British and American armies would soon land in Italy, perhaps even on the Tuscan coast. Emma shivered again. Allied planes had been bombing big cities like Naples in daylight hours for months, but now their raids had become ever more horrific. Just a couple of weeks ago, a squadron of 26 liberators had flown over nearby Grosseto. Having dropped their bombs on the airport, they'd then proceeded to fly low over the little town. Because of the suddenness of the attack, the sirens hadn't sounded until the planes were overhead. People dressed in their Easter Sunday best were thronging the streets. The liberators machine-gunned them, then went on to attack children riding a merry-go-round, and even fired on people trying to escape into a wheat field. The aircraft had wheeled back over Grosseto, machine-gunning a group gathered by the door of the church. Emma swallowed the bitter taste in her mouth. It made her ashamed of the British and American blood she'd inherited from her mother, and fearful for the future. Bella gave a whinny, jolting Emma back to the task at hand. She dismounted at the gates to the fattoria, home farm, at the rear of the villa, and smoothed her horse's sweaty neck. "Thanks for a lovely ride, beautiful." She kissed Bella's velvety soft nose and smiled as an equine whisker tickled her chin. Bella blew out a sweet hay-scented breath. Emma walked her in circles until she'd cooled down, then led her into the stable block at the far end of the courtyard. She brushed the dried sweat off Bella's coat and made sure she had a hay net and plenty of water. A whinny came from the adjoining stall, and Zorro, the estate's black Marimano stallion, popped his head over the half-door. "Ciao, bello," Emma said, going up to him. He nuzzled her long plait of red hair, shook his head and rubbed his forehead against her chest. She scratched his poll, her fingers threading through his thick forelock. "Are you missing Marco as much as I am?" Marco Landi was the son of the fattore, the estate manager. He was 2 years older than Emma, and she loved him like a brother. They'd grown up together, both of them without siblings. Marco had the patience of a saint, as far as she was concerned. It was he who'd taught her about the ways of the country folk, and she loved going out for long rides with him around the 5,500 acres of her parents' property. Zorro nuzzled her again. Both he and Bella were mostly used for pulling the farm carts to take produce to market when the white oxen were otherwise busy. But Papa allowed Emma and Marco to ride them as well, on the condition they took good care of them. She gave a sigh. Last month, Marco had been conscripted into the Air Force. He'd had to interrupt his architecture studies at the university in Florence and was an officer cadet stationed in Pian del Lago near Siena now. What would happen to him if the Allies landed? Most of the sons of the estate's farmers, who were old enough to have been drafted, were in the armed forces as well. What would happen to them? The echo of footfalls interrupted Emma's thoughts. Orazio, Marco's father, the estate manager, was approaching. "Your papa is telephoned, Emma. He's at the fortress. The British POWs are due shortly, and he would like me to drive you up there to meet them." Emma smiled at the fattore. When she turned 16, he'd begun to refer to her as Signorina. She'd reprimanded him, told him in no uncertain terms that she was Emma, like she'd always been. He'd then insisted that she call him Orazio in return. "I'll go and change out of my jodhpurs," she said. "I'll only be a couple of minutes." She'd been ambivalent about meeting the POWs after the bombing of Grosseto. But the men in question clearly weren't to blame. They'd been imprisoned well before that atrocity, in the big camp at Laterina, near Arezzo. Papa had used his contacts to be assigned a group of 50 to work on the estate, given that they'd been left short-handed by the conscription of practically all their able-bodied young men. Now that the Allied prisoners were about to arrive, Emma couldn't help feeling curious. Papa had driven to meet them at the Chianciano railway station to oversee the loading of their kit onto ox carts. He'd then gone ahead in his car while they marched the 8 kilometres to the estate's fortress, an old fortified settlement about a kilometre away, which also housed 2 keepers and their families, as well as the parish priest of the church within its walls. Emma was glad that Papa would reassure the keepers' wives, who were preparing to barricade themselves inside their apartments for fear of the enemy. Check on everything, and wait for the prisoners to arrive. After changing into a pair of slacks and a clean blouse, Emma replaited her dark burgundy braid. She touched the gold cross on the necklace her late mamma had given her, which she wore every day to remind herself of the woman who'd been a distant figure in her life. It was hard for her to reconcile the mother who was never around with the young Anglo-American woman who'd fallen in love with Marchese Ginori while staying with family friends in Florence. Mamma had been so smitten with him that she'd invested her capital with his to buy the Bivio estate soon after they were married. They'd had Emma almost straight away, but Mamma had soon grown bored with life in the depths of the Tuscan countryside. A wealthy heiress, she'd spent most of her time abroad. Emma had been home from her English boarding school for the summer holidays when Mamma's latest lover had driven his car off the road while under the influence of alcohol, on a winding road above Monte Carlo, killing both of them. Not long afterwards, Hitler invaded Poland, and Emma had never returned to her school. Papa arranged for a tutor to come twice weekly from Siena, and she was preparing her university entrance exams with the professore now. Emma left her bedroom and went down the steep stone staircase which led to the central hall of the villa, lit by a skylight. A door opened onto the wing that linked the 16th century house with the fattoria. Just beyond, stood the building in which the olives were pressed and the estate's oil made and stored, as well as the granaries, the laundry room, the woodshed, and, a little farther off, the carpenter's shop, the blacksmith's, and the stables. The villa and the fattoria formed, according to old Tuscan tradition, a single, closely connected little world, and Emma loved it more than any other place on earth. Orazio was waiting for her in the yard, where the ox carts brought in the wheat, olives and grapes from the estate's farms. They got into a small 3-wheeler lorry, and 10 minutes later, after heading up a steep dirt track leading through the woodland behind the fattoria, they'd reached the medieval fortress. Imposing stone walls towered above them, topped by a bell tower, and Emma remembered that an old lady used to live there. Papa bought the property 9 years ago, after the woman passed away, and added its 2,000 acres of land to the Bivio estate. Orazio parked the lorry, and she walked with him through the open big metal door of the entrance portal. The courtyard inside teemed with men, and Emma's ears rang with the sound of British and Italian voices. "There you are, Emma." Papa bounded up. "This is Lieutenant Russo." He introduced the short, dark-haired man who'd approached with him. "He speaks English and is in charge of the prisoners. Has a guard of 10 men from Sicily." Papa indicated a group of swarthy-looking soldiers who were milling around smoking. Orazio had inserted his way into the midst of them, probably to assert his authority as far as the estate was concerned. Emma shook hands with the lieutenant. "And this is Corporal Smith, the prisoner's representative." Papa presented a tall blonde fellow who'd made an appearance next to him. Corporal Smith saluted. "Pleased to meet you, miss." "Likewise." Emma forced a smile. Papa took her hand. "I'll show you around." She hadn't been inside the fortress since it had been prepared for the POWs. "Lead the way," she said, her heart swelling with love for her father. He stood head and shoulders above everyone else, not only physically but also metaphorically. In his late 40s, he still had the energy of a much younger man, despite his hair thinning and greying at the temples. The whole world loved and respected him, for he'd done so much for the local community. He wasn't entirely saintly, though. Emma suspected there were women in Rome and Florence who were more than just friends. He and Mamma seemed to have had that kind of relationship. Emma had been away at school and hadn't known too much about it until Mamma had died. Even now, Papa would disappear for long weekends from time to time, giving the excuse of business meetings. Emma refrained from probing. His love for her was unconditional, and what he did in his own time was his own business. She followed him through a doorway into 3 big interconnecting rooms, one of which had once been the stables. In addition, there was a dining room, kitchen, and washroom, with 12 basins and 2 showers, all freshly whitewashed and perfectly clean, if primitive. Beds for the prisoners, double-tiered bunks with straw-filled sacks for mattresses, had been provided by the Italian army, apparently, as well as cooking utensils and food that was to be prepared for them by a cook. She went up to a barred window and tugged at it. A sandy-haired young man with a close-cropped beard approached. "If you're doing that for us, miss, don't bother." He spoke in a Scottish accent. "Me and the lads have fallen on our feet here, we think." He laughed. "We were bored out of our minds in Laterina and can't wait to get our hands dirty in your fields." Emma stood back, looked him up and down. "Do you speak any Italian?" He shook his head. "No, but we're all keen to learn." "Good. Have you any experience working the land?" "We were all involved in gardening one way or the other back home. If we'd been farmers, we would have stayed behind to feed the nation." A smile lit his blue eyes. "Any chance we could have a bit of a field where we can knock a ball about?" "I'll ask my father, but I'm sure that can be arranged." She did so as soon as she was in the Fiat 1500 with Papa, motoring down the steep road back to the villa. "What do you think our farmers will make of the prisoners?" she asked him after he'd agreed to the sandy-haired young man's request. "I mean, they won't be able to communicate with them, will they?" "They're not here to socialize, mia cara. They're here to work. It will soon be time for the reaping and then the threshing of our wheat." Emma nodded. Life at Bivio was ruled by the seasons. "Any news from Marco?" Her thoughts were never far from the person she considered to be her best friend. "Oh yes, I forgot to tell you. He telephoned earlier to say he'll have some leave next month and will be back to help with the harvest." "Wonderful." She couldn't wait to see him. Couldn't wait to go for long rides with him. Couldn't wait to simply be with him and bask in his friendship. Chapter 2. A whoosh of heat warmed Rosa's face as the mouth-watering aroma of freshly baked bread filled her nostrils. She retrieved 2 round loaves from the outside oven, put them on a wooden tray and, in the style of a true countrywoman, placed the tray on top of her head. Keeping her body erect, her hips swaying in forward movements, she made her way up the wide stone staircase at the side of the farmhouse. Her family, the Vaninis, like all Tuscan farmers, lived on the upper floor above the storerooms and an arched recess where the farm's carts were kept. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, illuminating the golden fields of wheat blanketing the gentle slopes below. A crow cawed from the nearest of the cypress trees lining the dirt track. It flew down towards the Orcia, the river whose waters had been harnessed by the padrone, Marchese Ginori, about 20 years ago. Rosa breathed in the luscious aroma of the bread again. When she was little, she'd marvelled when her brother Maurizio had told her that, in the cities, people baked all summer in their kitchens. Not so in the Tuscan countryside, where the extreme heat made it necessary for folk to bake in red brick ovens built outdoors. Earlier, Rosa had used brushwood to create a quick, violent fire. The moment it had burnt itself out, she'd pushed the ashes to one side and had slid the loaves in on a long wooden shovel before dislodging them with a flick of the wrist. She'd reached the top step, so she lowered the tray from her head, wiped sweat from her brow with the end of her apron, and tucked a wayward curl of dark brown hair into her headscarf. She exhaled a deep breath. Maurizio had been conscripted into the army a year ago, when he'd turned 19, and had been sent to fight in Russia. They'd had no news of him since, and the entire family was bereft, not least Babbo. Rosa pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped inside. Her 2 younger brothers, Giulio and Alberto, aged 12 and 10, still far too young for the draft, thank God, were sprawled on the polished brick floor, playing a game they'd invented with some pebbles. Giulio looked up and gave Rosa a cheeky grin. She smiled at him, then glanced at her 3-year-old daughter, Dora, who was sitting with Rosa's sisters, Teresa and Ines, 8 and 6, at the kitchen table. Ribbons in their hair and pinafores over their clothes, they were leafing their way through a picture book, which had been a gift from the Marchese's daughter, Emma. She made a point of visiting the different poderi and bringing presents for the children, much to everyone's delight. "Mamina!" Dora cried. "Ho fame!" "I'm hungry." "Can I have some bread?" "I'll go and slice you some now, Cocca." Rosa's heart filled with pride. Dora was as bright as a button, curious about everything. She attended the asilo kindergarten, attached to the primary school which had been set up by the Marchese some years ago. Ox carts collected her and Rosa's siblings every morning and brought them home in the afternoons, along with all the other school-aged children on the estate. It was the summer break now, though. 3 months off, so the ragazzi could help on the poderi. Everyone pitched in, for that was the way of things. Farmers had big families for that reason. Rosa took the bread through to the far side of the kitchen, where Mamma, Nonna, and Lucrezia, Rosa's 16-year-old sister, were preparing supper while listening to a light entertainment program on the radio. "You took your time," Lucrezia muttered. "Mamma and Nonna are making me do all the hard work." "Not likely," Rosa retorted. And it wasn't. Lucrezia got away with blue murder. The prettiest by far of all the sisters, with thick, almost black, wavy hair and flashing dark eyes, Lucrezia had Babbo wound around her little finger. She would go to him with petty complaints, and he always took her side. Babbo was sitting in the corner of the room, cigarette in hand, and a glass of red wine from his own vineyard in front of him. He looked tired. It was hard work running the podere without Maurizio's help. If only Babbo's brother, Zio Virgilio, hadn't emigrated to America over 20 years ago in search of a better life. Babbo and Mamma were married shortly afterwards, and it had been expected that Mamma move in with the Vaninis. Babbo didn't have any other brothers. His 6 sisters had all left once they'd found their own husbands. That too was the tradition. Women went to live with their husband's family. The familiar smell of aglione, garlic-infused tomato zugo, permeated the air. Rosa placed the loaves on a counter and sliced a few pieces to keep the bambini going until the meal was ready. She handed them to the hungry children, then returned to the cooking area. The old hearth, with its enormous chimney where Nonna would sit on winter evenings, sometimes with a broody hen in a basket beside her, still housed the old range. A modern electric stove stood next to it, one of the many provided by the Marchese to his farms. He'd also installed running water and indoor bathrooms, making life a lot easier for them all. Rosa picked up a rolling pin to join in making the peachy noodles, taking her place between Lucrezia, Mamma, and Nonna at the flour and semolina-dusted work surface. They were humming along to a song on the radio, Chitarra Romana, and Rosa hummed with them while they rolled out the dough. As she worked, Rosa's thoughts drifted. She'd never imagined her life turning out like it had. She thought she'd escaped the drudgery of the farm almost 4 years ago, when she'd married Francesco, a waiter in the Chianciano Hotel. A year older than her, he'd been conscripted to fight in North Africa, leaving her pregnant. Sadly, she couldn't manage on her own in their Chianciano apartment. The alternative, moving in with Francesco's parents, whom she barely knew, didn't bear thinking about. So she'd come home to have her baby and wait for her husband to return. Except Francesco had died, in Libya, in February 1941, killed by the Allies. Rosa exhaled a deep breath. British prisoners of war were due to come to the podere tomorrow to help with the harvest. She would rather boil her head than have anything to do with them. The Vaninis had no choice in the matter, she reminded herself. They were a typical Tuscan peasant family, sharecroppers. As throughout much of the region, the bivio was run on the mezzadria system, whereby the padrone kept the houses in repair and provided half of everything needed to cultivate and improve the land, while the mezzadro paid him back in kind, handing over 50% of all that was produced. No one complained, for the bivio wasn't your average estate. The Marchese had been an exceptional padrone right from the start. Babbo told stories about how, when he was a young man, their pale grey Marimano oxen used to pull the ploughs that tilled the soil. The Marchese had subsequently raised money to purchase tractors, and then a threshing machine for the estate. Rosa remembered how desperately poor they'd been when she was little. She was always hungry then. Now, although they lived a simple life, they produced enough food to be self-sufficient. But anxiety niggled at the back of her mind. Everyone was talking about an imminent invasion by the Allies. She hoped Tuscany wouldn't become a battleground. Her chest tightened. What would happen to her family then? She felt sick with worry for Dora. It only made it worse that those maledetti allied prisoners were due to arrive first thing tomorrow. How she wished they could manage the harvest without them. With a sigh, Rosa went to help Nonna, Mamma, and Lucrezia add the peachy to the big saucepan of boiling water. She gritted her teeth. She would stay clear of the inglesi, come what may. They were the enemy, even if they had been taken prisoner. A week later, Rosa was descending the stone staircase, balancing another tray on her head. Salami and seasoned tomatoes, which would be a mid-morning snack for the workers. Her shoulders tensed. She'd managed to avoid face-to-face contact with the POWs until now. A group of 6, plus a guard, had been arriving every day in one of the estate's ox carts. Alongside Babbo, they'd been cutting the wheat with scythes, placing it on the ground, and then tying it into sheaths. When all the wheat had been cut, they'd carried the bundles to the open space in front of the farmhouse and had built an enormous pale yellow stack ready for threshing. They'd been hard at it since dawn, when Marco, the fattore's son, home on leave for a few days, had arrived with a tractor towing the estate's threshing machine. Babbo had given the prisoners different tasks. 3 of them had been ordered to climb on top of the wheat and, with their pitchforks, throw bundles into the thresher, which then spat out the grains of wheat from below. Lucrezia, Giulio, and Alberto were collecting them in sacks. The other 3 prisoners were unloading and stacking the bales of straw that came out the other end. Rosa couldn't resist a smile. To protect themselves from dust produced by the threshing, they had tied knots at the 4 corners of their handkerchiefs and placed them on top of their heads. She placed the tray of food on the wooden trestle table set up in the shade of an olive tree. The POW's guard was sitting there watching the goings-on with a pistol in his belt and a cigarette in his hand. Buongiorno. He wished Rosa good morning in Sicilian. Before she could respond, Mamma appeared with a bottle of Vin Santo, sweet wine. "Time for a break!" she shouted. Babbo put down the staio, the wooden container with which he and Marco were measuring the threshed wheat. The fattore would soon arrange collection of the produce to be handed over to the estate. After grinding the grains into flour, 1.5 quintals per person was allowed to be kept, and the rest needed to be handed over to the government stores, the amassi. Marco, who spoke good English apparently, went to invite the prisoners to enjoy the food and drink. Within minutes, Rosa found herself surrounded by the enemy. Her chest tightening, she turned on her heel and made her way up the outside staircase to get on with preparing the harvest celebration lunch. At the top of the steps, curiosity got the better of her. She paused to take a good look at the POWs milling around the table below. Dressed in shorts, their sleeves rolled up, there seemed to be nothing remarkable about them. All 6 were fair-haired, their skin tanned from being out in the sun, and they were all similar in height, slightly taller than Babbo and Marco. Only one of them stood out. He appeared more well-built than the others, and before she knew what was going on, she found herself admiring his tall, muscular form. Disgusted at herself, she turned her gaze away. The valley spread out below, dust-coloured now that the wheat had been brought in. Soon the weather would turn even hotter, and it would become a land without mercy, a land without shade. Even if she sat under an olive tree, there would be no respite, for its leaves would become like little flickering tongues of fire, and the cry of the cicadas above would split her ears with their high-pitched song. "Mamina?" Dora was tugging at her skirt. "Me, Ines and Teresa have been helping Nonna make the peachy, but we're tired now." Rosa bent and lifted her daughter into her arms. She kissed her plump cheek and with love in her heart carried her back inside. When Babbo's share of the sacks of grain had been loaded onto the prisoners' shoulders and had been emptied into the granary beneath the house, it was time for the harvest celebration lunch. The Marchese had arrived in a 3-wheeler lorry with his daughter and the fattore. Rosa carried the last tray of food down to the forecourt, where Giulio and Alberto were having fun jumping into the mountain of locca, the dust that had come out of the threshing machine. Try as she might, she couldn't help a quick glance at the prisoners. They'd stripped off their shirts and were sluicing themselves down in the open with water drawn up from the well. The fresh, clean scent of Marseille soap mingled with the aroma of wheat and straw. The muscular fellow turned and beamed a smile at Rosa. She hurriedly tore her gaze away. Mamma called everyone to the long trestle table, where she was ladling out clear meat broth. Rosa took her place next to Dora, well away from the POWs and their guard. Babbo had insisted that they join in. "They've worked well," he'd said. "They should be rewarded." Rosa watched them surreptitiously while they tucked into the celebration banquet. Smoke-cured hams were followed by piled-up dishes of peachy with alluring. Then came 2 kinds of meat, a great gander, loccio, fattened for weeks beforehand, as well as tender stewed rabbit. Deliciously sweet tomatoes, aubergines, red peppers and new potatoes accompanied the main course, which was washed down with flask upon flask of red wine. Even the children were allowed to have some, watered down to keep it from going to their heads. When all the plates had been emptied, Rosa and her sisters cleared them and returned with platters of pecorino sheep's cheese, which had been made by Mamma and Nonna. After handing them around the table, they went back to the kitchen to fetch the dolce, the dessert. Cantucci alle mandorle, small almond-flavoured biscuits made without yeast or fat and baked twice for a satisfyingly hard bite. These would be dunked in vin santo, the ubiquitous sweet wine. Marchese Ginori proposed a toast, and everyone responded, "Salute! Here's to good health." The muscular man met Rosa's gaze as she placed a plate of cantucci in front of him. "Come ti chiami?" "What's your name?" Surprised that he could speak any Italian, she told him. "Mi chiamo Tom Johnston," he said in reply. Flustered, she turned on her heel. Out of the blue, the prisoners started singing Happy Birthday. Although the words were in English, it was the same tune as the Italian version, and it turned out that the birthday boy was Tom. The entire table joined in, except Rosa. Her stomach rolled with misery. Today was also her late husband's birthday. How could she have forgotten? Francesco should be here, enjoying the festivities, not an Englishman called Tom. "Amina, can I have a peach?" Dora tugged at her sleeve. "I don't like a cantucci." The biscuits were too hard for her, and the vin santo too alcoholic. "Come, Cocca." Rosa held out her hand. "Let's go and pick you one." The fruit orchard grew on the same level as the farmhouse, next to the vegetable garden, and there were ripened apricots, as well as the first small peaches of the season. Rosa picked a red gold peach and sat herself down in the shade, with Dora cuddled on her lap. Warm sun beat down on the pale slopes below, now despoiled of their riches. Only the olives and vineyards were still green. It would be the grape vintage next on the calendar, but not until September before the rains returned, and the making of their olive oil would take place before Christmas. Footfalls sounded, startling Rosa. Her heart missed a beat. Tom Johnson was approaching. She held Dora close. He lowered himself down. "Fa caldo." "It's hot." He wiped his brow. She asked him how he'd learnt to speak Italian, but he clearly didn't understand her question. "Io italiano un poco." "Me, Italian, a little." He brought his thumb towards his index finger. Come ti chiami? Dora chipped in to ask his name. He told her, and it seemed he was about to attempt further conversation, but more footfalls sounded as Emma was walking towards them. Your grandmother went upstairs to listen to the radio, she said. She came back down and told us that the Allies have landed in Sicily. Emma repeated what she'd said to Tom in English, her expression darkening. A sick feeling spread through Rosa. What will happen now? Emma remained silent, obviously at a loss for words. But Tom sprang to his feet, his face wreathed in smiles. Of course he'd be smiling. He's the enemy, Rosa reminded herself. She watched him run back to the table to share the news with his fellow prisoners, and her heart filled with misgiving. Chapter 3. It was a beautiful September day. The extreme heat of summer had passed, and Emma had gone with her father to Siena. They found a parking space in Market Square and walked to the Piazza del Duomo, graced by the glorious white marble facade of the 13th century cathedral. Papa lengthened his stride. I suppose I'd better make tracks. He had an appointment to introduce himself to the new prefect, the man in charge of governing the province. I'll meet you at the Canon d'Oro, Emma said, a modest restaurant where she and Papa ate lunch whenever they visited the city. At 1 o'clock, cara. Good luck with your shopping. She was on a quest to buy gifts for the children on the estate, as well as stationery for herself. Her chest squeezed with excitement. She'd recently passed the university entrance exams and would be studying law in Siena next month. Outside the Palazzo Reale, a 3-story ochre-coloured building with barred windows on the ground floor, she kissed her father on both cheeks. A dopo. See you later. After watching him go through the enormous iron door leading into the prefettura, she made her way to the Piazza del Campo. Every year she and her father would attend the Palio, Siena's annual horse race around the square. Sadness slowed her steps. There hadn't been a proper Palio since Italy had gone to war with the Allies in 1940. A war which the majority of Italians hadn't wanted. A war foisted on them by Hitler. She spent a couple of hours searching the shops for gifts and stationery. Stock was low in most of them, and some were almost empty. Wearily, she made her purchases, placed them in her rucksack, then headed for the Canon d'Oro at the top of the town. Inside, she glanced around. Her father hadn't arrived yet, so she walked across the terracotta-tiled floor to their regular table under an arch in the corner. A waiter approached, and she ordered a glass of water. She checked her wristwatch. 1:10. Papa was late. She picked up a fork and fidgeted with it. Her father was meticulous about being on time. A feather of anxiety tickled her spine. A month ago, he'd received a letter from the fascist militia in Siena, ordering him to gift them a motor car. He still hadn't replied. Political arrests were happening all over the country, but surely not to Papa. Emma's hand trembled, but she told herself not to be silly. Her father hadn't done anything wrong. She should be more worried about the Germans than about the local fascists. She thought about the Allied successful invasion of Sicily. The Axis air defence had been negligible, and no reinforcements had arrived from Germany. The Tedeschi had abandoned their Italian ally, as they had done in Africa and Russia. Not long afterwards, news came that Mussolini had been deposed, betrayed by his own men. Emma and her father had been shocked by Churchill's statement. If the Italians have neither the will nor the courage to free themselves from Germany, we shall continue to make war upon them from every quarter, by land and air and sea. Italy will be covered with scars and bruises from end to end. How completely and utterly heartless. Allied planes then began dropping leaflets on Italian towns and cities. Out with the Germans, or fire and steel will be used against you. Since then, more and more Germans had been turning up in the Val d'Orcia, close to home. Tanks on manoeuvres, gunners camped beneath Radicofani. Papa said German armoured divisions had also crossed the Brenner Pass from Austria. It was all too tragic. Rumours abounded that Italy wanted to make peace with the Allies, but the Italian government didn't appear to have any clear plan of action with respect to Germany. The Prime Minister was shilly-shallying, apparently hoping that Tedeschi would leave the country of their own accord. Fat chance of that. In mid-August, the Germans who'd camped below Radicofani suddenly left. Not to return to Germany, unfortunately, but to head south. Soon afterwards, the first Allied bombs had fallen on the Val d'Orcia near an isolated farmhouse, wounding 3 people. Presumably dropped by planes lightening their load on their way back to their base. The same day, Messina had capitulated. The Sicilian campaign was over. Would a campaign on the Italian mainland happen next? Emma and her father had sat and waited, with an ever-increasing dread of invasion and diminishing hopes of peace. Italy would become a combat zone, and that broke Emma's heart. The Allies' exhortations to the people to rid themselves of the Germans was like urging a sheep to rid itself of a wolf. 5 days ago, on the 3rd of September, she and Papa were listening to the BBC when it was announced that British and Canadian troops of the 8th Army had landed in Reggio Calabria, the toe of Italy. The news was subsequently confirmed on Italian radio. A great Allied convoy had been sighted off the Bay of Naples. Emma's pulse had thudded. A landing was imminent. "Sorry I'm late." Papa's melodic voice interrupted her fearful thoughts. "That pompous new prefect kept me waiting for an age." He pulled out a chair. "Did you have a successful shopping trip, mia cara?" She reached across the table and squeezed his fingers. "I think I bought every last picture book in Siena." "Good." A smile gleamed in his eyes. "The children will be delighted." Emma and her father enjoyed a tasty lunch of gnudi, ricotta, parmesan, and spinach rolled into balls, served with melted butter, crispy fried sage, and a dusting of pecorino cheese, all the while chatting about the estate children and various jobs that needed to be undertaken, steering clear of war talk. A pleasant respite that Emma appreciated. Replete, they made their way through the medieval streets to the car and set off for home. About 30 kilometres south of Siena, on the outskirts of the pretty 14th century walled village of Buonconvento, they reached the same roadblock where their travel permits had been checked that morning by stern-faced soldiers. Emma's father brought his Fiat 1500 to a halt. The soldiers were grinning from ear to ear now. A private took Papa's papers from him and gave them a cursory glance. "Soon we won't be checking people's permits anymore." "Oh? Why is that?" The soldier's grin widened. "Haven't you heard? Our captain just told us an armistice has been signed with the Allies." Grimly, Papa thanked him and drove on. "Do you think it's just a rumour?" Emma asked, taking in her father's serious expression. "It's been on the cards for some time, sweetheart. But I'm worried Badoglio, our Prime Minister, has been too hasty and has rushed into this without having a proper plan." Emma's shoulders drooped. "You mean a plan about the Germans, don't you?" "I expect they'll occupy all our main cities and will counterattack the Allies in the south. Maybe even form a line of defense across the Apennines." "What will Italy do?" She could hear the panic in her voice. "Badoglio should have closed the Brenner immediately, after taking over from Mussolini. Instead, he allowed massive numbers of Germans into the country. Italy,
and the Allies will just have to deal with them, my darling."
They lapsed into silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Emma couldn't help worrying about Marco. Would he have to fight the Germans? He was still undergoing training, but that wouldn't last forever. She missed him terribly and longed to see him again. He hadn't been home since July, and he'd been so busy helping with the harvest they'd barely spent any time together. It would be the vendemmia soon. If he was given leave to help pick the grapes, she wouldn't see much of him then either. After a restless night listening to the laughter and merrymaking echoing from the valley, the farmers had lit bonfires and were rejoicing in the belief peace had come. Emma woke to the news that the Allies had, indeed, landed south of Naples. She sat glued to the radio in the sitting room for much of the day. At lunchtime, she heard that Bologna, Padua and Verona had already been occupied by the Germans. In the evening, a friend phoned her father and informed him that the king and Badoglio had left Rome.
"I can't believe it," Papa said. "How can they abandon us to the Tedeschi?"
Emma worried even more about Marco then, and said as much to her father. What will happen to him?
"It's a desperate situation, mia cara. We can only hope and pray he'll be all right."
The telephone rang, and her father went to answer it.
"That was the main POW camp in Laterina," he said after hanging up. "They want us to tell the lieutenant and his soldiers to protect our prisoners from any German attempts to seize them. I'll go up to the fortress now. Wait here, Emma, and stay tuned to the radio."
She did as he requested, trying to keep her spirits up. The situation seemed surreal, as if she were going through a bizarre nightmare. Except it was actually happening, and she wouldn't wake up and find life had gone back to normal. The radio kept repeating Badoglio's proclamation that he'd signed the armistice to save the nation from further and graver misfortune. How short-sighted of him, with the Tedeschi already at our doors. Papa returned momentarily and sat himself down in his armchair next to the radio.
"I found the lieutenant and his soldiers making preparations to run away," he said. "So I told our prisoners they were free to go, but they'd be unwise to set off along the roads, where they'd run straight into the Germans."
He extracted a cigarette from his silver case and lit it.
"I suggest that as soon as the Allies land further north, we'll let them know, and they can make their way across country to join their own forces."
What did they say to that?
"They agreed it would be best to wait. I've promised them a map so they can become familiar with the lie of the land."